Welcome, everyone, to today's Praxist Table Talk. I'm Mayloria, the Media Administrator. Our discussion for today will be about the portrayal of different types of love and how they are expressed. Joining us today, our founder, Vincent.
Hello.
Very important member of leadership, Cody.
Hello.
Also with us again, Goji.
Hello.
How you guys doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
As well as usual.
Yeah.
Had a nice relaxing break, and so I'm ready to get into this conversation. But the topic for today is essentially the various types of love, and especially non-sexual love. And I guess you can say the way that it would be expressed, or the way that it's kind of is portrayed in modern society versus the true implications of that type of love. And as well as, we're going to dive deep into these various types on their own. So, like you have the type of courtly love that is what your traditional romance is considered. And then you also have fraternity and brotherhood and stuff like that. And then you also have like the more platonic friendship type of love that could go with that could go in either a romantic or a fraternal direction, depending on the situation. But yeah, I think there is quite a bit of a discussion to be had here. And then we're also going to discuss how that has become entirely kind of perverted. In a literal sense too, in modern society, with the sexual element being so prominent in just every type of love imaginable. So I do think that there is a lot of meat to discuss here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to get into it. So does anyone have any opening statements?
Well, I do have a few, I guess. You want me to give an introduction on Eros?
Sure. Do you want me to do that, or do you want to do that?
I think I got a good one.
Right.
So Eros, E-R-O-S, is the type of sexual love that was coined by the Greeks. And for a lot of the people dipping their toes into the pagan world, or dipping their toes into writers like Evola, with him writing a book named Eros, and I think it was Eros, the
Mysteries of Love.
Domination of Love. Mysteries of Love.
Yeah.
Things like that. It is the up-and-coming discussion or topic of discussion amongst many circles on what is this sexual passion and motivation that resides within all people, not just men or just women, but this desire, once we reach maturity, to find someone to be our mate and have children with and share this type of bond with. But that type of love seems to have been commandeered, and now it's an overriding factor in modernity that seems to be obfuscating all other different types of love. And it's stemming in many different ways from the overproduction of, or even just the existence of pornography in the porn industry, but in subtler ways, like in TV programming, in advertisements, in other means of propaganda, and even going so far as the corruption of children's entertainment that is perverting the minds of the youngest in our society, whom we should be protecting from this type of entanglement, because they're too young to understand the implications of that. One of the clearest and most volatile examples being that Pride Parade presented on children's show Blue's Clues. And that was something that many people, parents from all across the country, were up in arms over, for even having the suggestion made for a child's program, let alone approved and then published. It was poor judgment, to say the least. But what's important is that a lot of the solutions that we need for this finding of restraint back in society over these sexual desires, especially with new terms coming about like Coomer or incel that describe much of the over-sexualized nature of our society, especially for millennials and Gen Z alike, is looking back to the past, not in some iridescent, or not iridescent,
like iridentist way.
Iridentist way, but as a legitimate example of what our ancestors did. Even not that long ago, to just have modesty and abstinence in our society to keep the brakes sort of pedaling on those natural desires, because we're not going to be prudish in any way over these things, but there is an amplification of these desires that have been commandeered, like I said, and being used for many devious avenues and pursuits that damage other types of love and bonds and relationships that we have in normal, healthy societies, and damage sexuality itself in various perversions and darker aspects of it that come out in the fall of our civilization. And we can see that looking back at civilizations like the Greeks and the Romans, the Chinese, the Persians, so on and so forth, throughout all of antiquity up until today, and even closer remnants like the Victorian era of the UK.
Yeah, there's kind of a lot to unpack there, but yeah, there's quite a bit of substance to unpack when it comes to sexual or romantic love and the tie between sexuality and romance. And this can go in one direction, and we can speak on the symbolic elements of sexuality in like kind of like mythology, like you were talking about, going down that type of pagan path for people who are diving into like that realm of discussion. Really, there is a lot to discover there for like behind the meaning of sexuality or behind the meaning of romance.
I just mentioned that because of the term eros itself is being most commonly circulated in those types of circles, either the paganistic route or the Evolian, Gainadian sort of
like more like metaphysical
thinking. Yeah. Those two places are where eros specifically comes from, but that's just one of the many words that the Greeks and other cultures throughout the world and throughout time have designated towards a specific type of love. And there's, I think, almost 10 we have here that we can discuss, but we may not get to all of them.
Yeah, so I think eros is a good place to actually start off on as we enter this discussion, because there's a lot of substance to unpack even within that avenue of discussion with the overarching topic of love, because it is so innate to our nature to have to reproduce. And so even if you look at the various symbols which pop up, sporadically in ancient societies and religious texts and things like that, you find an emphasis on either a masculine or a feminine element. And you even find a differentiation between the masculine and the feminine elements to begin with. And it's this sort of differentiation and this type of and these emphases that, and even the existence of this dichotomy in specific, that kind of characterizes the necessity for love. It kind of essentially demonstrates the innate interlink between humanity and creation, and the mingling of the various forces. And if you dive into these various religions, you'll find like sometimes you have these theisms which have the world originate as like the will of a certain god, and then you have the avenue of organism, which has the world kind of generate out of happenstance or out of circumstantial circumstantial like events, chain of events. But the common element in between these two things is that there is always a masculine and a feminine kind of force to be reckoned with there. And so that's the way that's symbolized in mythological writings. And so obviously there is that drive in humanity to kind of I guess keep itself
Meet
alive.
the balance of those forces.
Yeah, meet the balance of those forces, kind of keep itself alive through those forces, and develop an understanding of what it actually means to love and what the reason for love is, and why, or I guess romantic love, or the Eros type of love, and why exactly we feel that way. And so I think that also when you get into this area of discussion, when you get into this realm of thought of this specific type of love, it becomes hard to differentiate between this type of love and another one that is very close in nature, like familial love.
That's a point I wanted to make too, is that these loves are not exist in a vacuum. They interweave with each other and interweave with the broader senses of society to strengthen the fabric of society as is. They're merely threads or portions of this fabric that should be present and should be preserved, because without them, then the entire thing kind of unwinds in a sort of hateful mess of dysgenic chaos that we're currently seeing in our own societies.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at, is essentially that there is an interlink between the feelings of emotion and then also the necessity to reproduce and the necessity for these things to actually exist within us. And getting to the bottom of it and really understanding it, I think that's what we can do with this episode. So jumping right into that first.
Goji, do you have anything to add to what we've said so far as well?
Well, the way that I think I would define love, and I heard this somewhere before, it stuck with me ever since, is that love is simply the impetus for creation. And that can take any kind of form, whether it be procreation, whether it could be the fermentation of a skill, or actually building something, creating something, or it could even extend to just genuine friendships too, just like wanting to create experiences. But going off of that whole balance aspect, the natural order works that way, in that there's a balance of just about every kind of extreme. Both extremes, in this case, love and hate, creation, destruction, all of it is just balanced. You can't have one without the other, and if you have too much of one, then the other just falls off completely. So there's a need for both of those in there.
Yeah.
So Vincent, take it away.
Yeah. So I think that I would say I would define love as kind of the characterization of a certain necessity or creative force. So I think that that's a very good assertion you made, Goji, because that kind of falls in line with this stream of thought. But kind of just jumping right into Eros. So when we dive into the mysteries of love, so to speak, that's kind of what Evola called them in his book, you find various symbols which kind of orient themselves towards the end goal of humanity, or some type of end goal. And I think that that's what we need to kind of understand love as the manifestation of an end goal, in the degree of psychology and of a predisposition or a dispository pulling towards something, or attrition or attraction towards something that can't be explained with any rational in any rational terms. It can only be, it is something that is only understood by another being who is able to feel that same type of attraction, that same type of pull, and for the same reasons. And so that's why you can't quantify love. You can only qualify it. You can only speak of its qualitative value. And so it is kind of a means to an end in that regard, where it is the force of creation, or it is the drive behind the force of creation. And so that means that ultimately there does have to be an end goal for what love is supposed to be. And that kind of leads me down the magnum opus for alchemy. I won't get too much into that, but the magnum opus for alchemy was to try to unite the sexes, and actually, the entirety of, or the entirety of the symbolic element for sex in general was to unite the sexes and unite what are considered as two halves into a whole. And that's kind of what you see in religions across the globe, is that this unity between a masculine and a feminine force, or between one half and another half, or between a spiritual and a material force. It kind of is that balance that you were talking about, Goji, with that. So the magnum opus of alchemy is kind of the, if you want to think of history as very linear, it is the end result of that, of the understanding of love in that regard, which is to create this type of being who is almost androgynous and doesn't need to have either or, because he is both. And so that's kind of what the end goal of love is symbolized as in certain texts, is to try to not end creation. I don't really know how to characterize this quite properly, but it's not to end creation, but it is to kind of create so much that it doesn't really need to have a purpose anymore. And I think that's interesting to look at, because
an end step.
Yeah.
It's like a last step.
Yeah, an end step or an end location. And I think that's interesting to look at, because it's not really considered when we talk about love on a day-to-day basis. We talk about love, it's really more about friendship or what you enjoy doing. But there is kind of an end to it. There is kind of something to look towards. And that's something that's kind of forgotten.
Is kind of related, because we might have been getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but there's actually a sort of word for that from the Greeks. That's agapo, and that's the sort of unconditional love for all mankind, for all things, for all creation, that is usually attributed to figure like God, especially God of the Bible, which in Greek translations, that's the love that's often pronounced from God himself. And God usually being considered the Father in the Trinity of everything through Christian religion. It seems like that's the masculine aspect of it, although he is seen as more of this androgynous figure himself, just as the angels are, and so on and so forth, because they are beings beyond our physical realm. But agapo is much of that end goal here. I think you guys are thinking of, where it is this unity of all things in the physical realm of our world, and then beyond that into a higher understanding of our plane of existence and beyond, to have this love for all things, the agapo.
Yeah, and I think that when you kind of quantify that, you have to get down to the way in which that works out. So that's where you come into that type of sexual love that you find between the two sexes, masculine and feminine, and man and woman and stuff like that. That's why that kind of exists. And so there's various degrees on which this love manifests itself. You have the psychological attraction, like I was speaking of earlier, where you feel that pull, and then you also have the physical, desirability. That's
pragma, by the way, the psychological sort of pull.
Yeah.
But continue.
So you have that psychological pull, and then you have the physical, or I guess what gives you the physical desire to go out and pursue that love, because that desire in your head is kind of I don't want to say worthless, but meaningless without that physical outlet to pursue it and for it to actually have an outcome. And that, I think, is what we can look at as a sexual attraction.
Well, what do you mean by that? Explain.
Well, for example, because I don't get me wrong, I don't mean that like these things have to have like just strictly physical ends, but if the purpose of sex is to unite the two sexes, but it's also procreation, you can look at the Christian doctrine, for example, and there's a lot of talk about how sex is only for procreation and keeping humanity alive. Obviously, there's a necessity for that to kind of take hold. There's a necessity for that to happen. And so that's what I think sexual love kind of manifests itself as, is this mingling or this unity that's happening in the upper sphere of that how do you say, like that sort of attraction, that unity that's kind of going on in the upper sphere manifests itself.
Just to understand and reiterate, are you saying that the physical manifestations of love, like sex through eros, are the manifestations through a certain divination of this broader love, this agapo, that kind of exists on a higher plane?
Essentially, yes. I'm saying that it's kind of like one offshoot of a greater whole, if that makes sense. So like there's that agapo, that unifying and holistic love that is felt for all things, and then there's these different ways in which that manifests itself. And for man and woman, that would be sexual attraction and love, and the purpose for that is obviously that unity, that reuniting of those two halves, or however you want to explain it, that, and then also keeping humanity alive, giving another generation for this kind of continuity to continue to exist. And so that's what I think we can characterize sexual love as in that regard, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And that is kind of associated with what Bronze Age Pervert is saying. I'm reading Bronze Age Mindset right now, and he's kind of going through the mental exercises on challenging the Darwinian mindset of people to understand humanity on a psychological front, and taking this idea that we're just animals, and that animals in totality exist just to survive and procreate, but there's a certain nobility with all of existence that has behaviors and mentalities and contradictions in our existence, that if we were beings that just strictly saw our own survival as a means to an end, that end being procreation, then we shouldn't exhibit all these different contradictions. And a lot of that manifests through love and things like honor and behaviors that are so specific to certain animals that fit in their place in this broader scheme of the world, that seem to deteriorate this materialistic explanation of what our world is.
Yeah.
And I think what we're talking about right now kind of reinforces the point he's making in a certain sense.
Yeah, because I do think that there is I guess meaningless wasn't the correct word to use in that regard when I was talking about that outlet, but I guess what I was trying to get at was that that attraction needs to have some kind of actualization, and that does include a physical type of actualization, which is the continuity and survival of things. But that also kind of contradicts these other branches that are all offshoots of the same unifying whole. So you have that eros path, that survivability path, that kind of reuniting of the sexes, which we can talk about also when we talk about the masculine and feminine principles and stuff like that. But that kind of contradicts with a more moralistic discussion, or a more I guess you could say morally oriented discussion, which is like should you be having sex with just random nobodies, or should you be finding a partner and staying with them and stuff like that. So it's really how all these forces are arrived at. Do you arrive at the sexual principle by beginning from this holistic love, or do you arrive at the sexual principle from that natural inclination to survive, and that's it? And so that's where you find, I guess, these contradictions that you were kind of characterizing and talking about with the book you were reading.
Yeah, because I think to answer that question, especially setting up that moral framework, which will borrow in part from the religious authority that is kind of necessary to back all moral frameworks, but even a more materialist explanation to help those who might be skeptical of those kinds of frameworks for their worldview, is to look at human behavior and the outcomes of societies that are collapsing, like ours, and our immediate evidence that we see with our own eyes, some quantifiable, others intuitive, and looking through history on what has worked with our ancestors and the precedent that they've set with the moral justifications that they found, especially through their religious doctrines that are all seeking for that higher authority beyond just the word and desires of man alone. And eros, I think that sexual love is so prevalent today, one, because it's such a powerful motivator for mankind, because we do all want to have children for the most part, with exception becoming now, because there's so much of a perverted twist of things that have happened, but we'll get to that in a second. But also because we want some sort of companionship with the opposite sex, usually. Again, another perversion that's a symptom of our collapsing society that we'll get to. And those two things fall in balance with the greater fabric of society. So that companionship is something that you can only find in a manifestation of eros itself. So kind of splinters. And then that starting of a family, that bearing of children through the act of procreation, through the act of sex, is something that leads into a different type of love altogether, the familial love that you have. And that leads to far more fulfilling and far more holistic outcomes for ourselves and society as a whole. And we can see that just through the scientific evidence that we've gathered through, I think, a century of sexual research and in psychology.
You know, I think that morality itself can actually be considered as one form of love, or I guess the alignment with morality can be considered as one form of love that kind of derives from that love of all things, right? Because to have a moral framework, you have to at least want to preserve something, or at least want to protect or stand behind something and kind of espouse it and promote it even. And so to have a morality is to kind of love whatever it is that you stand behind and promote, that you instinctively or consciously value. And so that's what I think that morality could be characterized as in a broad sense, or I guess the human element of morality, right? Because we are, if you orient, or if you originate from the semantics that, you know, everything is kind of preordainment and spontaneity alike, then there is obviously a dichotomy between something that might supposed to happen and then something that actually does happen. And so obviously there is kind of an objective morality that you can gather and find and speak upon and identify. But then there is also the capability to not align with that morality. There is the capability to not be a moral person and not value these things. And so that's that disconnect that I'm talking about. That's that secondary and more relative element, is to not be able to align with that morality. It's to not feel that love for all things. And so that's why even here you have the characterization of two different elements, two halves that kind of need to meet in the middle to create a whole. So you have all of these things. You have a hierarchy or an overarching reality that encompasses all things, which includes a love for this reality. And then you also have that humanistic element that is kind of lesser to reality, but still plays a part within it, that is disconnected from it also, that has the capability and even the duty to align with it, but also the capability to misalign with it. And this unity could be considered a love between reality and God and stuff like that, and humanity and the more naturalistic elements. And that's why I think some people have a hard time characterizing quote unquote objective morality. You know, they characterize it in purely doctrinal or dogmatic terms, which come straight out of certain texts. You know, it exists because this text said so, or this guy said so, when you can really kind of examine the certain traits of reality and come to these conclusions on your own. And I think that, that's kind of a tangential topic about morality, but it really does kind of it does kind of demonstrate that kind of love that we're talking about now, with the necessity for two things to exist and then also intermingle. And it is that kind of creation force also, where you have people do things out of their love for, I don't want to say all things, but out of their love for, or out of their specific emphasis of a love for a certain thing. So, they create they create an institution to try to protect something, like, I guess,
or maybe not even an institution, but just an agreement with other people.
Yeah. One of the oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to say to make sure we can have a proper flow of the conversation, we can take what you've just said and segue into the bastardizations of these loves and how they're negative aspects, they're obsessions in a lot of senses, because each one of these loves has a sort of bizarro to them, or taking them to the extreme, which is harmful in many senses. And we can examine that and then go into these different categories of love more specifically, like familial, or what was the word for it? I think it was storge, I think is the Greek. I might be mispronouncing that, storge or whatnot. That's the familial building of that building, the family, and not just family in the sense of the nuclear family either, but like the clans of old, the family lines that go across the cousins and distant relatives, as well as up and down the family tree with the coming generations and the old to respect and take up the torch after them.
Yeah, the family could even be considered like the nation in the old regard of the nation having kind of like a shared common origin, and all living in the same location and all having shared the same values for plenty of years. That could be considered a wider, a broader definition of the word, family in that regard.
Right, exactly. And the problems that we're seeing a lot today are this corruption of eros and another type of love called ludus. And ludus is a more playful, in the moment type of love that's something like when you're a little kid and you just met someone on a playground for the first time, and you'll never see them again, but you have this sort of understanding and compassion and love for them because you're all kids and you're just having fun in the moment and being spontaneous little brats that make the most out of it.
It's kind of like an innocent. It's kind of like an innocent love, really.
Yeah, unless it's taken to its extremes, like we're seeing in modern society, which turns into hedonism, and eros turns into this addiction of sexuality and this transfixion on both that are incredibly narcissistic and self-centered for many people. That further reinforces this atomization of society being brought down by pressures from the top of our elites and our world leaders and so on and so forth. Remember, when we say that, it's not just government officials either. Many of them are puppets of themselves. The people we're talking about, we don't know the names of many. So it is this corruption of these two types of love because they're incredibly powerful and incredibly addictive once you get set on a mindset of them, because you have the effects of this pornography addiction or this gluttonous attraction to different things to feed your own desires and become a slave to your own, I guess not even just interests, but desires, again, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of something because, Evola talks a lot about the inversion of the castes and the type of progression that history has been, or kind of involution or regression that history of humanity has been going on. And so, you begin with that sort of Brahmin priest caste, and then you have the emphasis of the warrior caste, and then you have the emphasis on the more like the kind of aristocratic caste, and then you have the emphasis on the merchant caste, and that's kind of where we're at today. And then so on and so forth. You get the communist emphasis on the labor caste, right? And so, kind of in line with that idea, there's also been an inversion in the different elements of humanity that have been expressed that kind of coincide with that certain thing. Because, you can kind of examine the dimensions of humanity, right? You have your on the outside, I guess we can go from the outside in. You have your physical needs. You need to drink water, you need to eat, you need to
have shelter.
Yeah, have shelter. You need to, it's kind of like the hierarchy of needs in that regard. You need to take care of your physical needs, but also there's an element to you that desires physical pleasure. So, you want to sleep in the morning, or you want to
be entertained.
Yeah, be entertained is a good one. You want to taste something that you like. You want to have fun, so to speak. You want to have a thrill. That's that outer dimension. And then there's kind of various degrees as you go in. There's the strictly physical needs of stuff that you get pleasure from feeling, literally feeling. And then as you go in, there's that kind of psychological element to you, where there's a desire to not see something, but have something happen where you experience it, in a sense. I guess is the best way to put it, where it's more emotional in a sense, but it's still psychological. It's still individual to you. There's that level of personhood where
it's like Maslow's.
Yeah, that's kind of what
like just wanting to experience something.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
exciting, even life-threatening.
What were you saying, Goji?
Yeah, it goes the physiological. Sorry, yeah, just to help you direct it. What you're referring to is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and then self-actualization, which I think you were getting at right there before I interjected. Well, that's self-actualization.
The hierarchy of needs was one thing, but then also there's like the various degrees within humanity that kind of exist even outside of a hierarchy of needs, but it's more so of a hierarchy of desires, where you find that you want that physical stuff first, and then you want that kind of like emotional, I guess it's an emotional satisfaction, is the second degree. And then the third degree is what I would call virtue. I would call it virtue because it's something that's beyond emotion. You can't really feel it, and it's beyond physicality. You can't really quantify it, but it's something that you just innately know. It's like something that you intuitively know. And that's that third degree is virtue. And obviously there's various discussions in this regard too, discussing like the different elements of what makes up a person and all of that. But virtue, I guess you can consider, is the kind of highest form of all of that. And so as you see this inversion of the castes, you also see this inversion of what's been going on the inside, or the focus of the person in general, if that makes sense. So we begin with virtue as we begin with the priest caste, and then as we go out, we consider, or we come upon the time for the desire of emotional satisfaction. We come upon like the romantic stories, the romance mythology and stuff like that was kind of like the Renaissance era. And then this obviously spanned for hundreds of years, but now we have on the outside, we have we're living in the age of physicality, and we're living in the age of wanting to of the utmost desire being that physical desire. There's no longer a care for the emotional aspect of it, or if there is, it is subordinated to that physical desire. And then obviously the level of virtue is just completely forgotten. And so that's why what you were saying kind of reminded me of that, because there has been an inversion also of the various values of what true love actually means in society. There's or even the emphases of what love is supposed to be. And so
I wouldn't say it's an inversion necessarily, because that implies it's going in an opposite direction, but it could just be a perversion of those things. What it still is in essence is what it is, but it is a gross misrepresentation of what it's supposed to be, what it ought to be, instead of what it is. Yeah,
like for example, it's kind of working from the outside in. That's what I was meaning by an inversion, is that instead of arriving at the sexual element from being a masculine or a feminine person who finds obviously the opposite sex, it's arrived at through the physical desire itself, which then tries to make its way up the hierarchy back to virtue. So like you see people kind of gather for sexual pleasure itself, and then that attempts to be turned into a formal relationship, which then attempts to try to kind of virtualize itself or become virtuous in a sense. So rather than beginning at virtue and then working your way down, you kind of begin at physicality and work your way up. And that's what I mean by an inversion, is that the first element that is considered in today's society is that physical element of sexuality, sexual pleasure. And that's why I think you can find these sexual movements, including the sexual revolution and including the LGBT, as I think you can characterize them as the manifestations of this inversion. You know, especially the LGBT. It's entirely physically driven. It's driven by the physical attraction for a person of the same sex, or of wanting to identify with some type of physical expression of sex, and then trying to find another person based upon that alone, and then attempting to make that work and turn into something that is more emotional, and then attempting to make that work and turn it into something that is more virtuous, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I was getting at.
Okay, that's understandable. I see that as a generality mostly.
No, yeah, it definitely is an overgeneralization.
Definitive.
Yeah, it's definitely an overgeneralization.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair, because we can get on with that, those manifestations of that inversion then, like you said, with the sexual revolution and the LGBT stuff and so on and so forth, because they are the most present and in your face depictions of this corruption of the Eros and Ludus that have overwhelmed our senses in society, especially on the course of love overall, because they're only just a fraction of the loves felt between or amongst many different people in various different positions in society.
Yeah.
Goji, did you want to introduce this sort of perversion topic? Because I know you probably have a lot to say on that.
Well, I kind of want to begin at psychoanalysis, because I think it's a good. I think Freud Freud as a figure.
That's definitely a good spot to cover, because I have way more quote unquote experience in that field.
Yeah. So you have I guess the psychoanalysis beginning as a introduction of a type of Oedipus. Is it Oedipus Complex? Is that the right term I'm thinking?
Oedipus Complex is the term he created. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Oedipus is the whole sex with your mother thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, no, it applies to women too. It's sleeping with your father sort of deal.
Yeah. It's
so just parental incest basically.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's essentially that. And it kind of began, I've heard the theory that it began as a way for Freud to justify those feelings for himself, whether or not that's
yes.
Oh, it absolutely
true.
Was.
It very largely was true.
He, I believe he had those feelings towards his mother, and he actually did sleep with the family maid a few times.
Wow.
Interesting.
I didn't know that. But
I didn't know the maid part either.
Anyways, so kind of beginning from there, this is where you kind of run into the first encounters of this sexual element being so emphasized in society. You have the element being considered first is the sexual attraction or the wish for this act to kind of be done, if that makes sense, to kind of leave it ambiguous and without getting into too much detail. It really is, or it really began as an attempt to kind of justify all forms of love through that physical element instead of justifying the physical element through love, kind of like what I was saying earlier. So if you begin from there, you find that this seed that was planted with psychoanalysis and the Oedipus complex and all of that stuff grew and sprouted and kind of came into these other forms of love that you find. So it originally began with that type of familial love, that love you have for your family being justified through sexual feelings, which is a total kind of perversion.
Which is wrong.
Yeah, it's a total perversion of what truly should be virtuous, what should come from, that innate virtue, instead originating from sexuality. It is a perversion of the familial love principle in many regards. And so that seed kind of sprouted, and it kind of went kind of in every direction. And so now you have, for example, soldiers who would fight together and feel that kind of brotherly, fraternal love for each other. That is being considered as a sexual attraction between two men. And then you have on the opposite side, you have two women who might be very close friends with each other for whatever reason. That would be considered a homosexual love attraction, just because of that one seed that was planted. I think that's one of the
it's
major
that perversion of things.
It's something that I've definitely always despised seeing, particularly in entertainment. So like movies and TV shows, when two characters of the same gender are depicted as close friends, all of a sudden everyone who's watching it in this day and age thinks that they're a homosexual couple.
Yeah, especially
and
that's
treat them as that. It's
actually, I'm even guilty of thinking that in my interactions with people in real life, and just because things have become so inverted, like Vincent was saying, that interactions between men and women that seem close with each other, you don't know if there is some sort of sexual interaction going on there until you have further context going into their relationship. And usually that's a very personal thing between people, and people are very private about their own feelings in those regards. And people have been far more unashamed about those things, especially with the acceptance movements of the things like pride, which is hysterical considering that is two sins wrapped up in one altogether right there. But that's an aside.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at, is that you see these I don't want to say same-sex couples, but you see these same-sex individuals kind of interacting with each other, sharing a type of love that I would call platonic. This is just me, kind of off the top of my head. There's probably a word for it, but
philia it's friendship, usually like a deep friendship, a true friendship, someone you might risk your life for because you have a bond that's more than just surface level, sharing of interests. It's something that someone who you'd almost consider family but has no blood relation to you. That'd be like philia.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It is this feeling of being with another person that it's not just one who you, like you said, share the same values with. I think that friendship has been perverted in that regard, kind of attributed to this fault in a sense, where you see people being kind of afraid to get close to each other because of the implications that may have either for the other person or for society in general, which really kind of, I think, is a major cause for isolation and feelings of loneliness, feelings of loneliness and depression in modern society, especially because of that lack of intrinsic love that people are willing to have for their friends, or people are willing to make themselves vulnerable to, and susceptible to. And so, you get, when you do see an instance of that, it kind of makes you question, kind of what's going on there, because it's unusual to see now, whereas in history, that used to be a very common thing. And it's one of those things that is, like I said, the cause of isolation today, one of the causes of isolation today. And then also, it is kind of a cause for feelings of, I don't want to say embarrassment, because it's not the right word, but you kind of get what I'm getting at, right? You know what I'm kind of meaning by this. Yeah.
And an example that always springs to mind for me is this, when people ship characters together in entertainment and things like that, there's always this incessant degree of shipping same-sex characters together, even if they're historical figures. Like one of the big ones that made the rounds a few years ago, 2019, I think, was the movie 1917, about the soldier trying to deliver information to his brother, or his brother's battalion that's fighting on the front lines and who are going to get ambushed soon. And this guy wanted to save his brother and had some friend with him along the way. And it's one of those fraternal manifestations in being a soldier, that you get that deepest sense of companionship and philia, like is described by the Greeks, especially like someone like Alexander and his right-hand man, I forget his name, who's often looked at as like this homosexual relationship as well. But it's these detractors, talking about the movie 1917, that were thinking in totally sexually saturated terms about these two young men fighting for their lives in World War I. And it's disappointing to see at times, because it's sad to see people only thinking in those terms because their brains are so sex saturated, and they'd be a field day for Freud if he were still alive to see what has become of society. But also this perversion of society, that these other manifestations of love aren't known about, or aren't able to be described by people today. And so it's like we're saying right now, there's some suspicion of these two other loves, Eros and Ludus, that everyone thinks are the driving forces behind everyone's interactions. If not the highest motivation, then the sole motivation for people, whether it's between the same sex or especially between the opposite sex. And it's just frustrating and disappointing all around, because there is these deep-held companionships that you have, and soldiers is just a great example, because you take soldiers from anywhere around the world, in any nation, in any time throughout history, and there's a bond between them that's nearly unbreakable, short of like treasonous actions, and that's usually a betrayal of the soldiers' interpersonal trust as well. But in this sex-saturated mindset, that would be confused for some sort of homosexuality, like why I brought up Alexander the Great, because he was so close with his second in command, his lifelong friend he had, who was killed in battle, and then Alexander ended up drinking himself to death, which people will point out, oh, he's some gay guy, because Greeks in ancient civilization, even though that very likely wasn't the case.
Yeah, the same thing with Abraham Lincoln, I believe.
Yeah, there was also the thing with the ruins in Pompeii. They found
two guys huddled together.
Two male mummified corpses that were close together, so they automatically assumed that it was a homosexual relation. That's something that has been a thing for so long, and it's, well, I have no other word for it. It's pretty disgusting.
Perversion. That's what it is.
Implication that literally every human being alive during ancient times was homosexual.
It's like that justification that, like we were describing with Freud, of modern society projecting their own deviancies onto the past, because people want or have this agenda, like I brought up with Blue's Clues before, of spreading this type of hedonistic, hypersexualized worldview on everything around them, because that's the only thing they can identify love through. And that's eroded things like family bonds, friendship bonds, bonds with the church, and that agapo, the love of God and of the entire world, and even philatia, which is the love of oneself. And it's that's almost disregarded, and you're in this mindset of hypersexualization and hedonism that disregards your needs on a spiritual level and a deeper psychological level for these deeply materialistic desires and what would you say, vices.
Yeah. I think that's a good characterization of it, a good summary of the topic, because you have a lot of these people, like, for example, Lord of the Rings is another one where you remember that moment between Aragorn and Boromir, if you've seen the movie.
Yes.
There's that whole scene where he dies. That one is another one that is now kind of portrayed as like a homoerotic scene, instead of, the actual meaning behind it being emphasized. It's actually kind of curbsided for this new superimposed erotic, more so sexual type of narrative that is being put over it. So yeah, there really is a lot of avenues that this Freudian seed has kind of sprung into. Another one would be what would you say the love is called when an adult is not when an adult wants to protect a child, kind of like a fatherly love, in a sense, or like a motherly love.
Parental love, yeah.
Parental love, but is there
paternal and maternal?
But is there another word for that, like the ones you were reading off?
It'd be like that forge, or I don't know how to pronounce it, the familial sort of love, that responsibility to each other. It'd be like you trying to take care of your grandparents when they're old and frail as well.
Yeah, okay. It's essentially that one. I think the hypersexualization of all types of things has led people to do some obviously very terrible things, and the hypersexualization of I would say love, I guess you could say, is what led people to do this. Also, very materialistically driven, porn addicted people who are in a sense psychologically, I don't want to say damaged, but more so. No,
damaged is fair.
Yeah, I guess damaged.
Absolutely.
In a sense where that they're mentally ill, kind of deranged, I guess you could say, is another term. But there was a word there that I had and I just kind of lost it. But in a sense, yeah, that's the problem with the sexualization, and so that's led into things like massive amounts of pedophilia that's around in today's society, where now an adult who actually feels that genuine love for a child, especially if that child is not their own, like if it's someone that they babysat maybe, or if it's someone who's like that they have to take care of, or maybe they're
or even if it's just a general love for children, because when you're not getting propagandized with children being rambunctious little shits that destroy and cost so much money and all that, children are a genuine joy to be around. There's this beautiful innocence, this almost divine light that you see through a child that just fills you with joy, and that brings out those paternal or maternal instincts in you, where you're like, wow, this is great, I want my own.
They're
a handful,
exactly,
but they're worth it.
Exactly. And even that has become one of those things that's become one of those things that's like sexualized now. And so people make those same assumptions where, you have two people who might be the same sex who are friends with each other. They make the assumption that there's some kind of sexual innuendos going on there. They make those same assumptions with adults and children, especially, and more so now, I would say, in society than anything else, than any other area of love, because it's so dangerous. This one is especially dangerous because you have the predatory aspect of adults, literally misguiding and abusing children who are innocent in every regard. And so obviously that's why there's such a focus on it, and that's why it's become so kind of what's the word, tabooized, made taboo to kind of express your love for a child. But it really is a natural thing. It's a natural affinity that people have. Go ahead.
Unless they're your own child.
Yeah. That natural affinity that people have for children, that natural affinity that adults have for children. That's why, certain people become teachers. That's why certain people become coaches or pediatricians or anything that has to do with working in the field of children, because they feel that love for children. And because, they have kids who come in and interact with them that they do love, but not in that way. And it's unfortunate now that even that has to become so subdued in today's society, where you now have to kind of pretend that you don't know a child, or that you don't even like a child, because the love for a child is so much more dangerous to express. It's so much more reputation damaging in a sense. I know of a few cases where dads would take their children to parks, and they were sometimes they were called out as creeps, by these by older ladies who have no business, like literally the Karen meme, except in real life.
Yeah, because the dad is sitting on the bench watching their own child play, and then there's some uppity person that comes over and accuses them of being a pedophile.
Yeah. It's that.
If that's the one thing society maintains like a hypervigilance and paranoia about, I'm kind of all right with, because the consequences of not doing so are so high. But it's looking in all the wrong places in those regards. Like a dad watching their child like play on a playset or something. Mm-hmm. That's no place for people to just go and harass someone over. But it is things like in the school systems and in fields of coaching and stuff, where you do have these people infiltrating these spaces and violating children and corrupting children.
Oh yeah.
One of the famous examples is David Plauchi, who had his son kidnapped by his karate coach, and the kid was getting molested, and the dad, David Plauchi, came up, murdered the guy, got off on all charges with just probation, and everyone was like, yeah, right on. But then you have these other examples in modern day where it's serial pedophiles that exist in their positions for years, sometimes decades, like the Hollywood casting couch being one of them. Or you have people in positions of coaching or school teachers, like Larry Nazar, I think, is the guy that was that Olympic level coach who molested young girls who were trying to become gymnasts, or the rampant cases of grooming that's happened in the public school system, with people there for years and years in these schools just violating children in many different avenues. People want to point to institutions like the Catholic Church and that happening, but it's like they do have corruption in that aspect too, absolutely, and it should be brought to much more penitive justice. But the issues are so much worse in these other aspects of daily life that people ignore, and instead try to take out that frustration on normal people doing normal things, like a dad sitting on a park bench watching his children play.
Yeah, it really is one of those things where it has been completely flipped on its head. That's another one of those. That's another example of those inversions I was talking about before, and to kind of use this to segue into another topic. There are various mutations, mutations of love that can kind of appear out of a certain attraction. So like maybe a certain disposition, or maybe the fact that addiction is so prevalent in modern society. All of these can be attributed as the fault for this mutation of love to kind of take place. But there are certain things that result, I would say, from this inversion. So you have that physical desire, which is kind of like the last result of love en masse, if that makes sense. So like you have that large mass appeal to the physical sensory elements that is now characterized as the most universal form of love. And so that is attributed with generating this mutation of love that kind of takes place, which is it goes into the realms of kind of obsession or addiction, are the two that I remember seeing. You actually put in the chat, Cody, but obsession was one of them, and then I was addiction was the one I was kind of rattling around in my head. There are two.
I think. Sorry to interrupt, but I think Goji added too is a coping mechanism for some people as well.
Yeah. It is. But yeah, it really is. So I think that going first, I'll go with addiction because that's the one that I remember thinking the most about when we were kind of discussing this topic. But yeah, it really is that the final result of playing to the physical sensory elements. And it's actually probably the direct, or not the direct result, but the exact opposite result that you would find if you were to take love as originating wholly from within that virtue, that inner virtue, or that love for all things, that unifying and kind of holistic love that we talked about in the beginning of the episode. Addiction is, or I guess while that results in that type of unification of various dichotomies, addiction is the result of love which originates from that physical element, from that more relative element, that materialistic element. And it becomes manifested in things like pornography, right? You have a lot of, especially in the modern day, you have people who are addicted to pornography, and then that kind of directs how they behave in other romantic situations where pornography might not be, or where sex even might not be implied, simply because of the prevalence of pornography in this day and age. And I would actually recommend refraining from watching pornography altogether. Like, I know how much it is shoved in people's faces, but like the biggest thing that I've seen time and time again, people say that the biggest thing that helped them quit was to cut it cold turkey and just block themselves off from those sites. And this is kind of tangential to the point, but it really does help improve mental states if you don't engage in pornographic addictions and stuff like that. But even if you were to take the erotic element out, the sexual element out, you still have addiction in other spots. You have addiction for addiction to cigarettes, or addiction to drinking alcohol, or addictions to pretty much anything under the sun, really. Addictions to any type of feeling. And that originates, from that sensory element. You want the caffeine. You want the, what is it called? The nicotine. You want the sex, dopamine. Right? You want the dopamine. Exactly. And so that's why I think addiction is kind of that end result of a love which originates from the physical element, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I guess you'll get the obsessive types about it that manifest in all these different perversions of love as well, in the sexual kinds, or in the pragma kind, in some way, with things like parasocial relationships online and people getting too attached to personalities that don't have any idea who they are, or any relation they have with them, which is another unhealthy coping mechanism that would get to Goji's point, so I'll let him exposit on that more. Or in the Eros way with things like stalking of someone you might be sexually interested in, and that becoming a prevalent thing as well. A simping, which is something that's another one of those terms that are new within our last two generations. That is like the Coomers would be the biggest example for addicts, especially when it comes to pornographic and sexualized materials that have nothing but that mentality of over sexualization, even in interactions that are utterly platonic or void of a sexual undertone or overtone. Yeah. And these people that have these obsessive tendencies in any aspect or manifestation of love, like we've divvied up throughout the episode, turn out in destructive manifestations. And that is becoming an increasingly prevalent problem as well, that people don't really know what to do with because society's so atomized. So there's, even when there's networks or institutions there to try and help, it's not all there because people try to find these material solutions to problems that are spiritual in origin.
You know, you make the point of the stalking thing, kind of going back to that. I think that is a very, like, it's one of those things that I actually didn't think about when thinking of obsession. I thought of obsession more as like wanting to continue with a certain activity. It's almost like addiction, but in a different sense, where it's
they're all very related. The coping mechanism is the same. There's overlap amongst all three.
Yeah, but the bringing up of the stalker type of, I guess, the stalker archetype of person who's like obsessive of something or of somebody. It really is a kind of saddening element, or a saddening, I guess, experience to because I've known a few people who I was friends with a guy who really liked this girl, and so he would, like, you know, stalk her, not stalk her so much like to the weird extent, but, you know, he would be on her social media.
I think any bit is weird.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean more so like he would like just genuinely be all over her social media. He would like talk to her in the hallways between classes, and he was just genuinely trying to get at this girl who he had no chance with. And he would like her pictures, and he would you know.
That's what I meant about simping, is it might not be stalkerish in nature, but it's around that same mentality of obsession. It is dedicating oneself to a type of one-sided love that is not reciprocal. And love, I think by definition, is reciprocal in all aspects of it. You cannot have genuine love if it is not felt amongst both sides or among the many sides. If it's something like familial or philia that is could be shared between many people.
Yeah. And so what I was kind of getting at is that it is kind of a saddening experience. And so when that is carried to the extreme, you get these instances where people just need to have some kind of release. And so, you know, you have the that's where you get a lot of these murder stories from, actually, is people who were obsessed with one person who they couldn't get. And there's a tragedy there because there's a life lost, but there's also a tragedy in the mind of the killer, right? There's a tragedy in the mind of the person who acts, because this is somebody who did feel something. There was some kind of love there that was not reciprocal, but this person just didn't have the capacity to understand that and kind of get over it and cope with it in the proper way. And so what they now have is, or what results from it is now a bigger catastrophe and an even bigger tragedy that involves even more people. It's kind of expansive in that regard, but it is kind of an overall tragedy that I don't think many people acknowledge the side of love that is put into it, because it's that whole obsession thing is really not malintent on the side of the obsessor, right? It's not malintent. It's just a very unhealthy way of dealing with certain feelings that are supposed to be put to a productive use, but that now kind of come or finalize in a destructive result.
And I think a few of those are offshoots or symptoms that result as coping mechanisms for the atomization of society, because people don't have those genuine relationships with other people, many times even with their own family. And there's very few people that have genuine friends, that philia that we were talking about, that bond that is seen, especially between soldiers and whatnot, which is, I guess, one of the rare portions of life where you can find that sort of brotherhood or that sort of sorority amongst women, where those type of passions would manifest in a healthy, constructive, reciprocal manner. And then I guess the last one being the coping mechanism, which for a lot of aspects come out as the origin of these sexual deviancies that occur, especially in Eros, and especially in the LGBT or pride or gay or whatever you want to call it, is usually a coping mechanism through trauma, some sort of trauma that spurred on this sexual deviancy that people are trying to cope with. And like we mentioned before, there's all these other forms of love that are lacking in people's life that they use as coping mechanisms for that lack of reciprocal or even normal, healthy relationships. And they find themselves embroiled in any type of toxicity, whether that be among friends, air quote friends, that will go to lengths to impress people that end up being self-destructive, or simping over some person online, maybe having a parasocial relationship. And it's just an overall degradation of society that is people trying to find those connections, which existed through pretty much all of human history up until this point, because despite the technology we have to be able to be connected with each other, we are probably the most distant amongst ourselves in society ever. Even when vast distances spanned between people, there was always an attempt and dedication to people, whether it be your neighbors or people in your nation, or even some far-off land where a tragedy may have occurred. There was some compassion to help them and connect with them and build with them, that almost seems absent in many aspects of our society today.
You know, a good example of that would be the relationship between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin.
I don't know much about that.
Well, I guess to summarize, essentially these were two warriors that were against each other in the Crusades, the time of the Crusades, and while being on opposite sides of the war, they still held a great respect for each other, and I believe they even exchanged gifts and things like that, while they were still, like, the victory of one means the defeat of the other, means it could even mean the death of the other, you know, but at the same time, there was still a love between them. It was a different type of love, obviously, and it was more of a respect, but that respect is a manifestation of a certain love. But what you said just kind of reminded me of that.
Actually, that reminded me of something I wrote down too. If anyone's ever read Ender's Game or seen the show Samurai Champloo, that is very much the love for one's enemy. And it is a deep respect, because in order to understand your enemy, you have to understand them like you understand yourself. And that love of oneself, that philia, is something that's very deep and intrinsic and introspective and complex, because there's plenty of aspects about oneself that you might hate. And so there's the obvious contention between your competition or your enemy that you dislike, because they have to be your enemy or your competition for a reason. But in order to overcome that opposition from them, you have to understand them in a way that will make you appreciate them and love them to a certain extent. And that's a sort of pragma in a way, and a sort of philia in a way too. But it might be something entirely on its own. I wanted to say before, just going back, and I'll get back to this, when we were talking about obsession and stuff, I wanted to say that other cultures, not just talking about the Greek words that we're discussing here for love, have words for these types of things too. Like in Japan, when you have an obsessive stalker, that's called yandere, I believe, and that's someone who has that toxic form of love, that obsession that is stalkerish and intrusive on one's person that isn't reciprocal. And you could find many different cultures around the world that hold these languages, or hold these words in their language for these different types of love or perversions of love. Getting back to what I was saying. What was I saying now? Damn. Vincent, can you help me out?
I couldn't remember. I was like, I'll be there to remind him if he forgets, but then I forgot to, because what you were saying.
Such a quick point, but whatever. Let's move on then.
Yeah, but what you were saying does make sense, kind of with the different words, and it's kind of funny that in English there's kind of no way to express these different kinds of love, especially in modern English. You could maybe go back to Shakespearean to the Shakespearean times and find these various words that existed as a kind of romanticized version of the English that existed back then, even to find
an anglicized version of the romantic words.
Yeah, well, I mean more so like a Shakespeare himself made up new words. That's kind of what I mean.
Oh, I was thinking like Romance languages like that had different words.
Oh, but you could find these various concepts even then, maybe within the English language. But as it's become so developed and so commodified, even the English language really is a commodified language. You lose these different types of words, and there's even an absence of so many different expressions of love within the English language that really, when you say I love you to a spouse, it means something different than when you say I love you to a parent, or when you say I love you to like a niece or a nephew, or a brother or a sister, or a friend. Yeah, like, or a colleague even, or perhaps even an enemy, right? It's the same word, but it means a whole bunch of different things, where I feel like...
Oh, that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
Enemies.
Yeah. That is what you were saying. Anyways, we can get back to that in just a second. But there is a whole bunch of different characterizations of love in other languages, like for example, Greek. You've been bringing these up pretty much all episode. There's just these different words for these different types of love that exist, all within one language itself. Whereas in English, there is really no way to qualify these different types of love. It's all just love. It's all just another 4-letter word. And so, kind of getting back to what you're saying about the loving your enemy, and I believe it was Ender's Game you brought up.
Yes. And it was that point of Ender's Game where Ender himself is speaking to this veteran who's explaining how, in order to defeat this enemy that they're facing, these insectoid aliens that are threatening humanity, you have to understand them like yourself and be able to love them like yourself in order to truly defeat them. But it becomes tragic in that point because you have this deep, complex respect for them that it doesn't want you to harm them, because there's an understanding there, which brings up a lot of people throughout history, like, say, Lawrence of Arabia, who becomes this, not delegate for the Arabs during the turn of the last century, but a pioneer for the English in that part of the world, and then has this deep, profound love and respect for their culture, and helps these various tribes throughout the Fertile Crescent just go about and conquer lands that were historically theirs that are then now competing with the Turks and the English and all these other industrialized peoples that are muscling in on their territory, and so on and so forth. And you take something like the show Samurai Champloo, which is the story of these two swordsmen that travel through Japan, and they're of such high skill, no one really matches their level of expertise with the sword except each other. And they go through all different misadventures, guiding this young girl to find her father, that they end up defeating various different swordsmen in this deadly game of competition, that this finding out of who they are and their definitive skill level. But at least in the subtext of the show, it's never really explicit, and it's never really explicit in reality either, that there's this profound respect for each of the people they fight that is a genuine challenge to them, that is a genuine strain on their ability and a risk of failure that they might die, and a genuine respect for each other because they can't kill each other in any way because they're so skilled amongst each other. And it's that sort of ideal that I think is probably unique to men as a sex, that it comes from this competition with each other and this love for each other that drives you to be better than what you currently are, because there's that other person just over the hill that you know could put you to shame if you're not diligent on that discipline that you're excelling at.
Yeah, it's kind of like waging war like a gentleman type of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's that's kind of a good place to end off on if we kind of want to wrap things up.
There's so much more we can discuss on this topic and solutions to help with solving these issues of the lack of these types of love or the proper expressions in these type of love. But we could dedicate that to another episode and on just focusing on solutions.
I think that not only that, but we could also do that in the masculine and feminine one, because that kind of talks about sex and uniting the two. But yeah. Anyways, do you have any closing statements before we kind of sign off?
I'm all set.
Okay. So I guess for me, I would just say that, it's very tricky to kind of figure out the true implications of love, or the totality of the implications of love. And so if I were to leave with like a I don't want to say set of advice or word of advice, but if I were to leave with a sort of general summary of the topic at hand, I would say that kind of going back to what Goji said in the beginning of the episode, that love is definitely the force of creation. It is the force behind creation, and it is one that is good to kind of get to the bottom of and understand the origins and understand the implications and the results of whatever love is, because it really is kind of a means to an end. And it's not felt by all things, but it can be intrinsic within all things, like we've talked about with the kind of monistic love, or the love for everything. And so I would say, just take that as you will with all of the topics that we've discussed here, and hopefully there is some knowledge that was gained today.
Yeah, and with that being said, I hope everyone enjoyed listening into today's podcast. Make sure you check out our links in the description down below. You can find some of our socials. If you're interested in joining our community on Guilded, the link will also be in the description down below. Thank you so much to our founder, Vincent.
Yeah, no problem.
And our leadership council member, Cody.
As always.
And of course, Koji.
Good to be back again.
Yo, good to have you back. This was Mayloria, and we hope to see you all back here next time at the Praxis Table Talks.